welcome to NewsClick. Today we are going to discuss about the ordinance that the current BJP government is bringing to change Land Acquisition Act of 2013. To discuss the issue, we have with us senior journalist Paranjay Guha Thakurta. Hello Paranjay. We have seen that in 2013, the same act, Land Acquisition Act, Resettlement and Rehabilitation Act, was passed after a discussion within various political groups, of which BJP was part, and Sumitra Mahajan was leading the committee. So what was the need to change it when the BJP government came to power, and what are the major changes that it is proposing in comparison to the act which was passed in 2013?
The parliamentary committee headed by Mrs. Sumitra Mahajan, who belongs to the Bharatiya Janata Party, who was the Speaker of the Lok Sabha, took into account the views of all sections. For over 2 years, there were discussions among different political parties, state government, central government, and finally there was a consensus that this act needed to be brought in place to replace the 1894 Land Acquisition Act. Now, what has surprised a lot of people, and many people believe that this is perhaps the most controversial and most contentious decision taken by the Narendra Modi government, is that the ordinance that was enacted and the amendment to the act which is being sought to be passed is really diluting, and some would say completely negating, the very purpose for which the right to fair compensation and transparency in land acquisition, rehabilitation and Resettlement Act, called LAR Act of 2013, was enacted. Now, what are these key issues? The government is claiming that the earlier act had made land acquisition, especially for industrial purposes, extremely complex and cumbersome. Further, it said the need to bring an ordinance by the 31st of December 2014 was necessitated. Why? Because 13 other acts needed to be amended, and this pertains to the rehabilitation and resettlement of the land losers, and these acts relate to various sectors like national highways, metro railways, atomic energy projects, defense establishments, electricity projects, and so on and so forth. But the truth is that it's far, far more complex. What the government is saying is only one part of the story. What the government has done, it's virtually done away with the difference between what were earlier private projects, private sector projects, and what were public sector projects, and what are called PPPs, or public-private partnerships. Secondly, the consent clause. In the case of private sector projects, the act envisages that 80% of those who are going to lose their land should give their consent. That has been completely sought to be done away with. And finally, I think what is arguably one of the most sort of contentious and debatable issues is that it was legally mandatory to have what is called a social impact assessment. That if you're taking land from some people, then you have to have an assessment of what will be the impact on society. That particular provision, that legal provision, is being sought to done away with. And many of us would argue that this is like really going back to the British time, the Colonial era Act of 1894, the Land Acquisition Act, which had gave the government the eminent domain rights. That means the government was like all powerful and could do anything. Literally, it could acquire land from anybody at any price for whatever purpose. So the very purpose of enacting the Act of 2013 is being sought to be completely negated and done away with. Besides the changes that have been proposed in the Land Acquisition Act, there is another aspect which has gone virtually unnoticed, and that is the government, through a gazette notification, has amended the rules. It's tweaked the rules pertaining to land use within special economic zones. What can be used for commercial purposes, what can be used for non-commercial purposes, and the change in these rules would benefit a few corporate groups, and the biggest beneficiary would be the Adani Group. And everybody knows that Mr. Gautam Adani, who heads the Adani Group, is particularly close to Prime Minister Narendra Modi.
When you talk about this social impact clause and the cost clause for the consent, they also have mentioned 5 sectors where consent and clause for social impact will be removed. So what are these 5 sectors?
These include, special economic zones, large irrigation projects like dams, power plants and waterways, and it could also include, various kinds. When you say PPPs or public-private partnership, it could be anything from a tourism project to a cold storage plant to an educational institution to healthcare establishment. The basic purpose of having a social impact assessment was that the people who are going to lose their land, a proper evaluation, an independent evaluation needs to be done of what are going to be the likely benefits and what are going to be the likely costs. And those who are going to lose their land, they should become partners, they should become stakeholders in the project. Now, this was the basic principle behind putting together the 2013 Act, and the new ordinance, which is sought to be made into a law, completely does away with this very, very important and key aspect of the 2013 Act. But I wonder whether the government will be successful because of the opposition to this particular, the proposed changes in the law.
When we talk about this act, the current ordinance which the government is bringing, and when we compare it with 2013 Act, so there were two specific words, resettlement and rehabilitation in it. Now, when we talk about the ordinance which the current government is bringing, they say that this entire ordinance is pro corporate also and pro farmers also, because the compensation that which we are paying remains constant, the 4 times in rural areas and 2 times the market price in the urban areas. But so why is there such a stark opposition of this entire thing when the compensation remains the same, the package remains the same?
It is at best a half-truth, at worst a downright falsehood or a lie. And let me explain why. In our country, when land is purchased or sold, the real market value of that land is never disclosed in the official documents, in the official records, and in when the title deeds are changed. Why? Because by deliberately suppressing the true value of that land, you pay less stamp duty. So this is a standard technique where compared to the market value of the land, what is actually shown in the official documents and records may be 1/10 or 1/5 of the real value. Because you don't want to pay the stamp duty, and the bulk of the transaction that is taking place is not disclosed. It's in the form of black money. So if you are actually having the price of the land at 1/10 or 1/5 its market value, then even if you pay twice that amount or 4 times the value, you're still at best getting the market value. So that is at best a half-truth. The second point I think that needs to be made is what kind of public purpose or public-private partnerships. You could have a fancy hospital which is really meant for the affluent sections of the people. You could have an educational institution which doesn't cater to the poor or the underprivileged. You can have a tourism project or a cold storage project, all in the name of public-private partnership, but we do not benefit the ordinary people whose land you're taking away.
There has been ordinance regarding coal mines also. Now ordinance on land acquisition. So it's a clear exploitation of the natural resources of the people, and which is going to give benefit to the corporate houses. We all also know how Ambanis and Adanis have funded the current government. So do you see it as a broader agenda towards the neoliberal economic policies which the current government has been following?
Pranjal, there is no doubt about the fact that the corporate sector has been completely behind the Bharatiya Janata Party in general and Mr. Narendra Modi in particular in the run-up to the elections. So is this payback time? I wonder, because the changes in the law are clearly aimed at helping the corporate sector. It's helping big business houses, the corporate captains of our country. Now, where I want to here intervene and say is that even if the government wants to do this, it's not going to find it very, very easy. Mr. Jairam Ramesh, who was the former Minister of Rural Development, has pointed out that even within his government there was opposition to it from the Finance Minister, the then Finance Minister, Mr. P. Chidambaram. Though, of course, Mr. Chidambaram is today singing a different tune, in a sense, taking a position which was very different from the position he took internally within the government when he was the Finance Minister. But more importantly, it's not just the Congress, it's not just the left, it's not just the Trinamool Congress. The alliance partners of the Bharatiya Janata Party in the NDA, the National Democratic Alliance Coalition, they are opposed to it. And these include parties like the Lok Janshakti Party of Ramvilas Paswan. It includes the Punjab-based Shiromani Akali Dal. It also includes the Maharashtra-based Shiv Sena.
And the currently Aam Aadmi Party in Delhi.
Absolutely. The Shiv Sena has even said that it will go out onto the streets and it will have an agitation and get farmers to prevent the law from being amended. And as you rightly pointed out, large sections of civil society, Anna Hazare, Rajgopal's Ekta Manch, they are people out on the streets agitating against what is a virtual reversal of a law. And you are really going back more than 100 years to the kind of law that prevailed when the colonial rulers of this country had done. And one last point, and it's very important to note, the reason why the government will not find it easy to amend the law in this corporate-friendly, business-friendly manner, and that is because within the Bharatiya Janata Party and within the larger ideological fraternity called the Sangh Parivar, the various organizations that are affiliated to the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, these Hindu nationalist groups too, including the Swadeshi Jagran Manch, including the Bharat Krishak Sangh, they are also opposed to the change in the law. And that is why I believe that even though the government appears very keen to amend this law, it's going to face a lot of opposition. I want to make one point in this context. You see, what has happened is all of this is being done ostensibly because Mr. Jaitley and earlier before him Mr. Chidambaram claims that this new law makes acquisition of land cumbersome, complicated, difficult. Nobody is arguing that you should not be allowed to acquire land, including fertile farmland, including multi-crop land, to set up industrial projects or infrastructure projects. Nobody can take a view that this should never be done. The issue is rehabilitation and resettlement, a fair compensation, the consultative process, the people whose land you're taking, make them stakeholders, make them partners in this entire process. And the point to note is that Mr. Jaitley is saying that the present law makes the whole process very time consuming. But that's not the only reason. There are a variety of reasons why these projects get delayed. And let me read out or let me cite to you some of the recent findings of the Controller and Auditor General of India. It found that, at the end of, in early December 2014, at that point of time, there were 491 approved special economic zone projects. And this involved an area of over 51,000 hectares. But out of this amount, and this is over a period of 8 years, barely 40% of the land had been acquired and these special economic zones had been made operational. So even when the law had not been amended, you see, you are seeing delays in the entire process of land acquisition and establishment of projects. So to now argue that you need an ordinance to change the old law on which there was a political consensus, in my opinion, is not telling the full story.
So when you discuss about this CAG report and the 40% land which has been acquired, rest remains unacquired or unutilized. So earlier we had a provision that the unutilized land after 5 years used to go back to the farmers. What happens to that provision, and if the land remains in hand of these corporate houses? So even if these SEZs or the companies get shut down, they're going to sell, make it a real estate property and sell it at higher prices.
Yeah, that's the unfortunate part of the proposed amendment to the law, that even if a company fails to set up the project, those projects, whether it be a special economic zone or any other kind, or maybe it could be a cold storage, maybe it could be a tourism project, even if these projects don't become operational, even if that company goes bankrupt and goes under, they still retain control of the land and is able to resell that land, or there could be a transfer in the ownership of the entity, the corporate entity that owns that land. All of which is making it very, very industry friendly and corporate friendly. But what about the people whose land you're acquiring? What about the farmer? What about the person on the street? And it's not just a question of the farmer or the agriculturalist. It's a question of livelihoods. It's a question of livelihoods of entire families. So I think it will be extremely difficult for the government to to go through with the proposed amendments to the law, the Right to Fair Compensation and Transparency in Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act of 2013. I have a feeling if the government wants to push this through, everybody knows that the Bharatiya Janata Party doesn't have a majority in the upper house of parliament, the Rajya Sabha. It has a majority in the lower house of parliament. So the only way forward is to have a joint sitting of parliament to do this. But if that is the way the government proceeds to amend this law, I think it's going to run into a fair amount of opposition. We already see a lot of agitations taking place, and I think if the government is hell-bent on changing the law the way it is in the ordinance, then you're probably going to see more people out on the streets and more social unrest and more agitations.
Paranja, since you have been dealing with the economic issues extensively, so what do you propose a law or a act which makes it easy for acquiring lands, which also does not make it problematic for the farmers, which ensures fair compensations? So what is the way ahead for it?
See, I think a lot of the problems of the black economy, the illegal economy, is in the way land and real estate is valued and transacted. A very substantial part of the money that changes hands when land, the ownership of land moves from one person to another person, or when real estate transactions take place, is because you are not disclosing the true market value. The transactions are not in legal money or white money. A fairly substantial portion of well over half, often much more than half, all of it takes place in the form of black money. This is the same government which was talking about bringing back black money which Indians had, illegally stashed away in Swiss bank accounts. Mr. Modi, before the elections, had said that if all the money which Indians have kept abroad illegally is brought back to the country, then you would have been able to give 15 lakhs to each poor family. I mean, there would be no poverty in this country. 30% of your population, each family would get 15 lakh rupees. But even he realizes that this figure is not a correct figure. That 90% of the black money that has been generated in this country is within the country, and I would say a very substantial portion of the illegal economy, the black economy, and the money which has not been accounted for in this country is utilized for transactions in land and real estate. So if you can tackle this problem and make these transactions transparent, if you have the political will to take action against those who indulge in these illegal transactions, that would go a long way in reducing the size and the influence of the black money, of the black economy in this country.
Okay, that's all the time we have for today. We will be coming back to you on such issues. Thank you, Paranjay. Thank you for watching NewsClick.